Is this man lost or just too old to belong here? As the flag rope clicked and a coffee urn hissed inside the base training hall. They mocked him softly, scoffed under their breath, and protocol pressed him aside, and he didn't answer. Still, when a worn patch and an old coin caught the fluorescent light, the room fell into a silence you could almost hear like a held heartbeat. But quiet men leave echoes too, let me take you back. The sign at the entrance was plain and unapologetic. Base Training Hall authorized personnel only. Inside the morning moved with practiced efficiency. Boots crossed the polished concrete in steady lines. Clipboards tapped against palms. A coffee urn hissed softly near the wall, filling the air with a thin, bitter warmth. The base was awake and everything inside the hall reflected that urgency, straight backs, quick steps, eyes forward. Thomas Hale stood near the edge of the room. At 68, he was not slow so much as deliberate. His movements had lost their hurry years ago, replaced by something calmer, more exact. He wore a faded work jacket that had clearly seen better decades. The fabric was softened at the elbows, the seams worn smooth by repetition. On one shoulder sat a patch so old its stitching had dulled into the cloth, its shape still there, but its meaning no longer obvious at a glance. No one was looking at it. Thomas waited with his hands loosely folded, gaze fixed ahead. He wasn't in the way, but he wasn't quite part of the flow either. People passed him without thinking, their attention fixed on instructions and schedules. The room felt tight with motion, like a clock that had already started ticking. A pair of men a few steps away noticed him. One leaned closer to the other, eyes flicking briefly toward Thomas's jacket. "Relax," the man said softly, not bothering to lower his voice much. "He's probably just early. Or lost." A ripple of quiet laughter followed. Not cruel, not loud. The kind that slid easily into the noise of the room and disappeared just as fast. Thomas heard it. He didn't turn. He didn't stiffen. If anything, his shoulders eased a fraction, as though he'd already expected the sound. His face remained composed, unreadable, the expression of someone long accustomed to waiting for rooms to decide what to do with him. A supervisor approached, clipboard tucked neatly under one arm. His uniform was crisp, his tone practiced. "Sir," he said, polite but firm, "you'll need to step aside, please. This area's for active ranks." Thomas looked at him, eyes clear and steady. "Yes, sir," he replied. There was no hesitation in his voice, no edge, just acknowledgement. He took a small step back, exactly where he was told. As he moved, the cuff of his jacket shifted, revealing for just a second the frayed edge of the shoulder patch. Whatever symbol had once been sharp, there was now softened by time, its story blurred into thread and cloth. The supervisor nodded once and moved on. The line resumed its rhythm. Names were called. Instructions repeated. Pens scratched against paper. Yet something subtle had changed. The earlier laughter did not return. Conversations, thinned voices lowering without anyone quite realizing why. Thomas stood where he had been placed. He adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, smoothing it down with care. The gesture was small, almost instinctive, like straightening a collar before stepping outside. When he finished, his hands returned to their quiet rest in front of him. Around him, the hall seemed to pause between motions. Not fully still, but suspended, as though waiting for something unspoken to resolve itself. A young trainee glanced over, curiosity flickering across his face. He studied Thomas for a moment longer than necessary, then looked away, unsure why he'd done it. The coffee urn hissed again. Someone cleared their throat. The loudspeaker crackled before settling back into silence. Thomas did not move. He had stood in places like this before, rooms governed by order, by rules, by the certainty that everyone belonged exactly where they were assigned. He knew the feeling of being measured quickly dismissed just as fast. Still, he waited, and for the briefest moment beneath the steady machinery of procedure and habit, it felt as though the process itself had slowed uncertain, as if even protocol hesitated before him. The supervisor's voice carried again steady and practiced, cutting through the low hum of the hall. "Let's keep this moving," he said. "On-base procedure doesn't leave much room for flexibility." He tapped his clipboard once as if to underline the point, and motioned for the next name to step forward. Thomas remained where he was, just outside the line. He watched the process unfold with quiet attention, the way a man watches a clock he no longer needs to check. Around him, the room slipped back into motion, but the earlier ease was gone. A young trainee shifted his weight and glanced at Thomas again. The look on his face was not mocking. It was puzzled. "Sir," the trainee said, raising his hand halfway, unsure, "is he supposed to?" "That's not your concern," the supervisor replied immediately, not unkind but final. "Eyes forward." The trainee's hand dropped. A faint flush crept up his neck as he stared straight ahead, jaw tightening. He didn't argue. He didn't try again. Thomas noticed. "It's fine," Thomas said quietly, offering the trainee a small nod. "Rules help keep order." The words were simple, spoken without bitterness. His voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had spent years living inside systems larger than himself. The supervisor paused, looking at him for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you, sir," he said. "We appreciate cooperation." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied. Behind them, someone shifted in line and muttered under their breath, "Just like the post office line." A couple of people exhaled softly, the comparison landing with a familiarity that drew faint, knowing smiles. Everyone had stood in that kind of line, waiting, inching forward, watching the clock, while nothing seemed to move at all. The supervisor pretended not to hear. Thomas adjusted his stance, turning slightly to make room as another trainee passed behind him. As he did, something slipped briefly from the shadow of his jacket pocket, a small coin, old and dulled by years of use. The edge caught the light for half a second before Thomas's hand closed gently around it and tucked it away again. The trainee closest to him saw it. He frowned, curiosity sharpening. "Is that?" The supervisor's voice cut in once more. "Focus, please." The trainee swallowed his question. His eyes flicked back to the clipboard, but the crease in his brow remained. Whatever he'd seen had lodged itself there. Thomas met his gaze again just long enough to offer reassurance. Not explanation, just acknowledgement. "It's nothing," Thomas said softly. The trainee nodded, though he didn't look convinced. The line advanced. Names were called. Responses echoed back, short, sharp, efficient. The rhythm felt mechanical now, as if the room had shifted into a lower gear. Each movement seemed louder than before, each pause more noticeable. A man farther back cleared his throat. Someone else checked their watch. The supervisor recited another instruction, his tone unchanged, but his eyes avoided Thomas now. Thomas stood patiently, hands folded once more. His posture was relaxed, but there was a firmness beneath it, a quiet refusal to shrink further than he already had. He did not glance at the door. He did not look for allies. He waited. The trainee beside him shifted again, uncomfortable. He opened his mouth, then closed it. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Sorry," he said, not to Thomas directly, but to the space between them. Thomas inclined his head. "That's kind of you," he replied. The exchange went unnoticed. The supervisor continued calling out names. The hall answered back one by one. Yet the sound seemed thinner now, as though something essential had been pulled from the air without anyone quite seeing how. A few people glanced toward Thomas, then quickly away, unsure why their attention kept returning to him. The coin remained hidden. The patch stayed unnoticed. No explanation was offered. The room moved forward, obedient and orderly. Then the room noticed the silence. The supervisor glanced up from his clipboard again, scanning the line as if something were slightly out of place. "Sir," he said, addressing Thomas without irritation, "we're going to need you to stand fully to the side, just to keep things orderly." The words were measured, almost apologetic, but they carried weight. A few heads turned. The request hung in the air longer than it needed to. Thomas nodded once. "Of course," he said. He moved slowly, not out of reluctance, but care. One step, then another. He positioned himself flush against the wall, hands relaxed at his sides. He did not sigh. He did not glance around to see who was watching. The room adjusted around him. Conversations thinned. Someone shifted their feet and stopped. The steady cadence of names and responses faltered, then resumed with less confidence. The sound of boots against concrete seemed sharper now, echoing more than before. Thomas stood apart exactly as instructed. A few people looked at him, then looked away, unsure why the separation felt heavier than it should have. The earlier laughter was gone. Even the quiet murmurs had faded. The space felt tight, compressed by something no one had named. The supervisor cleared his throat and continued. At the far end of the hall, the door opened again. A man stepped inside and paused. He was older than most of the trainees, his hair silvered neatly at the temples. He wore a civilian coat that still carried the posture of uniformed years. He didn't hurry. He let the room settle before taking another step. This was the retired officer. His eyes moved across the hall with practiced ease, taking in faces, posture, alignment. Then they stopped. On Thomas. More precisely, on the shoulder of Thomas's jacket. The officer's gaze lingered there, tracing the worn outline of the patch. The stitching was faint, the edges softened by time, but the shape was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. The officer felt something catch in his chest. For just a breath, the training hall fell away. He was no longer standing under fluorescent lights. He was on a wooden porch outside an old barracks, the paint peeling the air thick with summer heat. A porch swing creaked gently beside him, its chains worn smooth by years of use. Men sat there in silence, boots off, uniforms unbuttoned, watching the day settle without needing to fill the space with words. The swing moved back and forth, slow and steady. The officer blinked, and the hall came back into focus. Thomas noticed the look, though he didn't turn fully. He felt it the way one feels a change in temperature, subtle but unmistakable. Still, he kept his eyes forward. The supervisor saw the officer and straightened. "Sir," he said, offering a nod. The officer returned it, but his attention did not leave Thomas. For a moment, no one spoke. Thomas stood where he had been placed, shoulders easy, weight balanced. He had been asked to step aside, and he had done so. He had been separated from the flow, and he accepted it without protest. The trainee who had tried to speak earlier shifted again, discomfort clear on his face. He looked from Thomas to the officer and back, sensing that something important was unfolding just beyond his understanding. The officer took a step forward, then stopped. Thomas remained still. He did not lift his sleeve. He did not point to the patch. He did not reach for the coin in his pocket. Whatever story lived there stayed where it was. The room waited. Still, he didn't explain. The retired officer raised his hand. "Hold." The word was not loud, but it carried. The shuffle of boots stopped. Pens paused mid-scratch. The low hum of the hall thinned until it was barely there. Every eye turned. The officer took one measured step forward, then another until he stood where everyone could see him. His gaze settled on Thomas, still standing off to the side exactly where he had been placed. For a moment the officer said nothing. Then he spoke calm and precise. He wasn't pushed by a hand. He was pressed flat by procedure. The sentence hung in the air, unexpected and quietly heavy. The supervisor stiffened. A few trainees straightened without realizing they had done it. The officer turned fully toward Thomas. "Sir," he said, "would you come forward?" Thomas hesitated only long enough to acknowledge the request. He stepped away from the wall and walked back toward the center of the room. His pace was unhurried, his posture unchanged. He did not look around to see who was watching. The officer waited until Thomas stopped a few feet away. Then the officer drew himself upright. "Master Sergeant Thomas Hale." The words were clear, deliberate. The moment his rank was spoken aloud, the room didn't just quiet, it rearranged itself around him. Conversations that had not yet stopped fell silent. A trainee lowered his gaze. Someone shifted their stance, feet aligning more carefully with the floor. The supervisor's clipboard dipped as his grip loosened. The atmosphere shifted, not loudly, not suddenly, but permanently. Thomas stood still, the name settling over him like something familiar. He did not smile. He did not correct anyone. He simply met the officer's eyes and nodded once. The officer reached into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out a small rectangular case. It was worn at the corners, the leather softened by years of use. He opened it with care and held it out. Inside rested a rank badge, dulled slightly with age, but unmistakable in its lines. "This belongs with you," the officer said. Thomas took the case. His fingers closed around it gently, as though it were lighter than it looked. He did not lift it for the room to see. He didn't need to. A murmur moved through the hall, not quite a sound, more like a collective breath being released. The trainee who had tried to speak earlier stared openly, now his expression caught between confusion and dawning understanding. The supervisor stepped forward, then stopped himself. He cleared his throat. "Master Sergeant," he said the title. "Careful, this time I wasn't aware." Thomas inclined his head. "That happens," he replied quietly. The officer looked around the hall, his voice steady. "Carry on," he said. No one moved at first. Then slowly the room resumed its function. But it did so differently. The line reformed with a subtle shift. Space opened where it had been tight before. Voices stayed low. Eyes lingered where they hadn't moments earlier. Thomas closed the case and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. As he did, the worn patch on his shoulder caught the light, its faded outline suddenly sharper in everyone's awareness. The officer met Thomas's gaze once more. "Good to see you again," he said. Thomas nodded. "And you," he replied. Around them, the base training hall returned to motion. Names were called, steps were taken, procedures continued. But nothing felt quite the same. What had changed was not written into any checklist or posted on any board. It lived instead in posture, in tone, in the quiet recalibration of respect. And at the center of it stood an old veteran rank restored not by demand, but by recognition. The supervisor stood a little straighter now. He glanced at his clipboard, then deliberately lowered it, as if the paper no longer deserved to lead the room. When he spoke again, his tone had changed, not louder, not softer, but more careful. "Master Sergeant Hale," he said. The title landed differently this time. It wasn't an obligation or a correction. It was an acknowledgement. Thomas turned his head slightly. Yes, he answered. The supervisor cleared his throat. Thank you for your patience, he said. We're going to make a small adjustment here. No one objected. No one needed to. He gestured to the line. Let's widen this out, he continued. There's no reason to crowd the entry. We'll keep it orderly without boxing anyone in. The trainees shifted, spreading naturally, the tension easing as space returned to the room. What had felt compressed moments ago now breathed again. Boots moved, shoulders relaxed. The hall seemed to exhale. The retired officer watched quietly from the side, hands clasped behind his back. A rolling board was brought in from the corner of the hall, the kind usually reserved for announcements and schedules. It looked like something you might see in a library, clean, simple, meant for notices that mattered. The supervisor took a marker and paused, considering his words. He wrote carefully. A name, a rank, a brief line beneath it. Nothing flashy, nothing overstated. The marker squeaked softly as he capped it. This will stay up, the supervisor said, so we don't forget. Thomas studied the board for a moment. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes softened, as though an old weight had shifted just enough to be noticed. A trainee near the back leaned toward another and murmured almost to himself, "Guess protocol can learn." A couple of people smiled, just slightly. The supervisor heard it and didn't correct him. Instead, he nodded once as if agreeing with the sentiment. Let's continue, he said. The process resumed, but it carried a different tone now. Names were still called. Responses still came back sharp and clear. Yet the room no longer felt like it was pressing inward. There was room for awareness, for memory, for something beyond efficiency. Thomas was invited back into the line not as an exception, but as a matter of course. The supervisor stepped aside to make space, the gesture small but unmistakable. Right this way, Master Sergeant. Thomas nodded and moved forward. His pace didn't change. He didn't rush to reclaim anything. He simply took his place exactly where he belonged. The trainee who had tried to speak earlier caught his eye again. Sir, he said quietly, thank you. Thomas considered him for a second, then replied. For what? For waiting, the trainee said. For being patient. Thomas gave a faint smile. Patience is easier when you know who you are, he said. The words settled gently without weight or instruction. The retired officer stepped closer, lowering his voice. You always had a way of doing that, he said. Letting people learn without telling them they're learning. Thomas shrugged lightly. They get there, he said. Most do. Across the hall, the board caught the light, its simple lettering visible to anyone who passed. A quiet reminder not of authority but of presence. The supervisor glanced at it once more, then returned his attention to the room. His posture was looser now, his voice less rigid. He wasn't giving up order. He was redefining it. As the line moved, Thomas felt the subtle shift around him, the way eyes no longer slid past him, the way space was offered without being asked for. Respect didn't announce itself. It showed up in small corrections, in how people adjusted without being told. Nothing dramatic had happened. No one had been called out. No apologies were demanded. And yet the room was not the same. What had changed wasn't written into the base handbook. It wasn't something that could be filed or archived. It lived instead in the quiet agreement that had formed between the people standing there, a shared understanding that recognition mattered even when it arrived late. Thomas waited his turn, steady as ever, the worn patch on his shoulder resting easily now in the open air. The hall moved forward, and this time it did so together. A few days later, the base moved at its usual pace. Morning light filtered through the high windows of the training hall, catching dust in the air and softening the sharp edges of the room. Boots still crossed the concrete. Voices still echoed off the walls. But the space felt calmer now, as if it had learned how to breathe. Thomas Hale stepped inside and paused. Near the entrance, just to the right of the main notice board, something new had been added. It wasn't large. It wasn't polished to a shine. A simple plaque mounted carefully at eye level. His name, his rank, a single line beneath it. Nothing more was needed. Thomas stood there for a moment, hands resting easily at his sides. He didn't touch the plaque. He didn't read it out loud. He simply acknowledged it with a quiet nod, the way one does when greeting an old friend. From somewhere deeper within the base, a choir was rehearsing. The sound drifted faintly through the hall voices, layered gently together, steady and unhurried. It wasn't loud enough to distract, just enough to be noticed. The kind of music that didn't ask for attention, but rewarded it. A familiar voice broke the stillness. Master Sergeant Thomas turned. The young trainee stood a few steps away, posture straighter than before, eyes clear. He looked nervous but determined. "Yes," Thomas said. The trainee swallowed, then spoke. "I wanted to say thank you for the other day." Thomas studied him for a moment. "For what exactly, sir?" "Not making it a thing," the trainee replied. "You could have. You didn't." Thomas considered that. Then he nodded. "Sometimes," he said, "the lesson sticks better when you let the room figure it out." The trainee smiled, relief easing the tension from his shoulders. "I won't forget," he said. "I hope you don't," Thomas replied. The trainee hesitated, then extended his hand. Thomas shook it firmly, the gesture simple and complete. When they parted, the young man stood a little taller than before. The supervisor approached next. He didn't have his clipboard this time. "Master Sergeant Hale," he said quietly. "May I have a word?" They stepped aside close enough to be heard, far enough to remain private. "I owe you an apology," the supervisor said. There was no defensiveness in his tone, just honesty. "I was focused on process. I missed the person standing in front of me." Thomas listened without interrupting. "It happens," he said when the supervisor finished. "Systems are built to move forward. Sometimes they forget to look sideways." The supervisor nodded. "I'll remember that." He extended his hand. Thomas took it. The handshake was brief, firm, respectful. When they released, the supervisor stepped back, visibly lighter, as though something had been set down. The training hall filled gradually as the day went on. People passed the plaque without stopping, but they saw it. Some slowed. Some glanced twice. A few paused just long enough to read. The atmosphere felt different now. Not quieter, not louder, just settled. Thomas moved through the hall at his usual pace, no faster, no slower. No one rushed him. No one asked him to step aside. Space appeared where it was needed. Voices adjusted without prompting. Respect had found its place not through force or announcement, but through recognition. As Thomas reached the door, the choir's voices swelled slightly, then softened again. He paused, listening for a second longer than necessary. The sound carried something familiar, community patience, shared rhythm. He pushed the door open and stepped into the light. Behind him, the base carried on. Procedures followed. Orders were given. But somewhere between the rules and the people who lived by them, a quiet correction had taken root. It didn't need to be revisited. It didn't need to be explained. It would be there the next time someone stood at the edge of a room waiting. And if this story moved you, share it forward. A few days later, inside the same training hall, the light felt softer, and the faint sound of a choir practicing somewhere on base drifted through the air, steady and patient, like a reminder that some things endure. Still, Thomas Hale didn't linger by the small plaque bearing his name and rank. He simply nodded once the way a man does when a door closes gently behind him, knowing it will stay shut. Kindness, he had learned long ago, doesn't ask to be repaid. It waits quietly like a lamp in a winter window, offering light without demanding anyone step inside. Then the room went quiet again, not from tension this time, but from understanding, as the atmosphere felt different now. A rank had changed the room, but respect changed what stayed.